hazing, but also accept hazing as an expected part of joining a group, and many describe it as, quote, fun and exciting. Why then does hazing exist? Why is it a problem, and why is it getting worse?
You have 1 or 2 seconds.
As many sentences as you fit.
I think the peculiarity of hazing. Okay, I'll speak louder. Can everyone hear me okay? I think one of the peculiarities about hazing as opposed to bullying is that hazing is a dynamic where you're trying to bring people into a group in a maladaptive way. So the individuals who are joining that group look for meaning by participation, whether it be an athletic team, whether it be a fraternity or sorority, honor society, any group where individuals, especially emerging adults, are joining. You're going to have people to try to develop a sense of belonging, a sense of connectedness. Unfortunately, a lot of individuals who are already in those groups don't know how to construct rites of passage, ways of belonging that are truly helpful in team building and bonding. They create their own, these pseudo rites of passage. And unfortunately, when you mix alcohol with that process, you get some very dangerous results. So it's that mix. So people may have felt like they were a band of brothers going through a really tough time and they survived it, and so it created meaning and they're belonging with their comrades. But at the same time, it can have very deadly consequences, and you don't know the individuals who are joining the group to know if they're predisposed to it being harmful or helpful.
Now, is there a disconnect though if people feel that it's, as you said, fun and exciting, but it's also dangerous? Are those kind of mutually exclusive things, or can they?
Oh, I think.
How do you reconcile both of those at the same time?
My own personal opinion is that yes, they can be combined both. I think to join a group should have some rigorous process, but you need adults, you need elders, people with wisdom to assist those who are joining the group to do so in a healthy, constructive, formative way, so it doesn't get out of hand and create something that's totally different than what the group is designed to promote.
Well, would anyone else have to respond?
If not, we can keep on going.
So I would only just add, Dan, specifically to your question of are these mutually exclusive, no, I mean, you have to remember that hazing exists as a definition on a very broad spectrum of the risk levels of kinds of activities. And so on one hand, most people would say something like paddling would certainly be hazing, and most people would be against it and would not tolerate it and would not certainly commit it. On the other hand, hazing is also something like wearing a silly outfit to the dining hall. And so there is sometimes this disconnect because it's a very broad spectrum of examples that fall under the definition.
Well, this is going to be it, because the next question is for you. As the university aims to end pledging as we know it, how do administrators plan on catching things that go on behind closed doors? Because hazing is such a secretive thing by nature, how do you actually plan on enforcing the policies that we're putting forth, particularly at frat houses that are 2/3 privately owned?
So there's a couple of things that I think that I would say. First, I don't think that any of us are operating under the delusion that we're going to find everything that happens. One. Two, I think that in order for the policy to actually be effective, there has to be a large level of buy-in from the students that hazing is not constructive. And we have a lot of work to do to help them understand, as Dean Pollard was explaining, that there are healthier, safer ways, more constructive and are aligned with the values and the mission and the purpose of these organizations that can bring new members in without it being hazing, without it being dangerous, without it having to happen in secrecy in the basement of a house, for instance.
This question is for Holland. So hazing often includes more than just drinking and expands to other embarrassing or uncomfortable activities demanded of members of an organization. And I think a lot of times we think of hazing as something that's male predominant. So what is the biggest issue troubling the sorority community when it comes to hazing?
I completely relate to kind of what you were saying, is that I think on our campus hazing tends to be thought of as a predominantly male problem. And I know that over a year ago when President Gordon first kind of talked about the pledge to end pledging, as we know, that I went to Travis and I honestly said, is this kind of just an IFC thing? And I think he kind of pointed out to me that a lot of what could be constituted or is hazing in the Panhellenic system tends to actually happen outside of the quote-unquote new member period. And I would say probably our biggest problem would be rotationals, in the sense that since we do kind of have this study abroad culture at Cornell, a lot of times when the seniors who've been abroad coming back to getting to know the sophomores, I think that's when sometimes those quote-unquote kind of hazing activities.
Do you want to just explain what rotationals are? If people don't know or are familiar.
It's usually kind of a get-together of the sophomores and the seniors in terms of getting to know one another, and I think in probably the past 4 years, I think there's been 2 review board cases involving Panhellenic rotational dinners, so I would say that that's the primary area of our hazing, but that's not just to say that that's the only area of hazing in our system, and I think all 3 councils realize is that we all have, a role to play in addressing hazing on both our individual council level and in the broader Cornell community.
Sure. This one is for Annie Noah. And so, in effort to end pledging as we know it in the Greek system, what is being done right now in the athletics department to reduce hazing? And what is the condition of hazing within the athletics department?
Well, each of our coaches has a particular stance on hazing, but the departmental stance is that hazing is something that if someone is forced to do it and they feel very uncomfortable doing it, whether it's dressing in silly clothing or shaving their head or performing some crazy acts, anything that makes one feel uncomfortable, we promote in our department as hazing. And the thing that I can do about it, since I'm not going to be in a lot of these particular areas where this type of thing may occur, I have to make sure there's a tone in the department whereby each head coach knows that they are specifically responsible as part of their position, their job description, if you will. They have to have discipline in their program, and they have to make sure that each athlete in their program understands that it is not what we're about. It's not something we respect. Times have changed, and it really isn't a rite of passage anymore. Your rite of passage is training hard and performing well. Hazing has, as we've known it over many decades, has no place in 2012 athletics. That's not to say that it doesn't occur, because I do know that it does occur. But I think it's the tone from my office through the head coaches that gets to the individual athletes, so they understand that this just isn't going to be tolerated, and we're not going to smile and giggle about it and look the other way and think it's cute, because it's not.
Now, is there any, you talked about discipline, is there any formal means by which, the Greek system has the judicial board, which is like a self-governing organization. Is there any means by which hazing infractions are taken into account in athletics?
Yes, I would say that each of these occurrences obviously is different. And my senior staff and I sit down, we talk about it. We've had, in the last 3 years, there have been 2 that come to mind where we sat down, we discussed it, we went back and forth as to how particularly serious a particular part of it is, and how we want to address that, but also mitigate occurrences in the future. And so we do it somewhat ad hoc on an individual basis. There's nothing in a booklet that says this will happen, but we tend to be more strict than less strict to send the message, because we are sort of in a transition in how hazing is looked at a university like Cornell. And so I'd say 4 or 5 or so of us sit down and really discuss it. The head coach of the sport is always brought into the discussion at some point to get their perspective. And we really care about fairness. We don't want to overdo it, but we also want to make sure that if we have a policy against hazing, that we don't sort of look the other way and be very lenient. So to send a subtle message that it's not that big a deal.
Now, from the coaches then, because it seems like if I'm a coach and my captain is leading or instigating a hazing incident, and this is my star player, and Cornell, has a wide breadth of athletic teams, some of which have been really successful. What's that conflict of interest like, and how can you ensure that it's not just being swept under the rug a little bit?
Well, you probably can't ensure anything 100%, but I can tell you the most recent circumstance that we had, it involved the best athletes on the team. And their coach, understanding how important it was for his or her situation, had a tone and had a philosophy where those individuals came forward before the next morning. In fact, there was a phone call about 1 in the morning where the coach became 100% up to date with what happened. And then I met with them at 8:30 in the morning, and these particular athletes just basically laid it out and took responsibility for what occurred. And then we spent quite some time hammering it out, but it was really a pretty good result. So again, it's the tone that the coach sets, and the coach is only going to set that tone if I set the tone with the coaching staff. Winning and losing is very important, obviously, but it's not as important as the experience that the young men and women under our charge are having at Cornell, and their behavior and how they represent Cornell is way more important than wins and losses. Although wins and losses are still important.
So this question actually came from our website online. As the end of spring semester, there were 560 members of the Panhellenic community, 680 members of the fraternity community, and 64 in the MGLC community. So for you, James, do you think the small size of the MGLC community makes it more difficult to report hazing and gives more of a free rein because it's just a fewer number of people?
So I would say, can y'all hear me? All right. So I would say that it doesn't necessarily, hazing allegations kind of affects our numbers. Traditionally, MGLC organizations we have a history of sometimes people don't necessarily are interested or join our organization because of the hazing allegations they hear at other schools. Traditionally, HBCUs and the Greek chapters there have a history of being violent in their hazing allegations. So it's kind of the thing where you're like, oh, this must happen here, this happen here. And I feel that in terms of our small numbers, that's not necessarily make it easier to hide the hazing. We are all well aware of people on campus that we see walking around that we know are undergoing the process. And we kind of just look out and see, we look out for each other, not necessarily overlook forms of hazing. If we see something egregious going on, then we report it to either myself or whoever VP Judicial happens to be at that time, or report it to Travis. I tell chapters to kind of go straight to Travis, because sometimes it's feels a little uncomfortable, like you're ratting out a friend to talk to another student. But going to Travis is kind of, he's like an impartial person. You don't see that he doesn't really know everyone as well. And that it's kind of like, he's like this overarching figure that people can go to and see as impartial to versus me as a fraternity member on campus and here.
Just one follow-up question to what you just mentioned. When you speak about seeing someone going through a process on campus, what sorts of things does that entail? And because the community is so small, how do you unpack that for the rest of the community to understand things better?
So, an example would be, in our process, we emphasize the dedication to academics and kind of showing everyone. So in my chapter, we have everyone bring out their schedule for the next academic year, and we have them look and see like the blocks of time and kind of how we map out a typical week and show them kind of where they can fit in times of studying, so they actually have more time to dedicate towards themselves and improving themselves. And I found myself that I spend a lot of time necessarily socializing. Like I was spending 2 or 3 hours at RBCC in the dining hall for dinner instead of going back and getting my work done so I can socialize later at night. So kind of just showing them and working with them, guys, people that are more dedicated with their academics. Whereas normally you see someone that spend their time in the library just talking, but instead like they're on their grind, getting their work done. And in terms of the community, like, what's the second part of your question?
Well, I meant more what you meant by you can tell that someone is undergoing a pledging process, because studying is obviously good, but I I would assume that there's more to it than that. And kind of the visual aspect of it.
Visual aspect is just, I would say, what I've seen is more like, they have more of a drive to them. They're kind of focused on a limited amount of time that they spend socializing. That's the most visual aspect. You'll see something like, they make compliments to someone, just like catch up, and then I'll go right back to it. Like, all right, I'll catch up with you later, I have work to do now, and go about, when we get this done, then we'll talk.
In terms of reporting within the community, do you think, just because there's a pretty big discrepancy between the amount that we hear from the IFC and the numbers we hear from Panhandle, numbers we hear from the MGLC. So I was just wondering, again, if there's anything else you think that comes with that. It's just that it's not happening in those communities and why that's different.
I wouldn't say it's not happening at all. I just feel that it's kind of a lot more, I see it's a lot more discussed within our community. And that people kind of discuss it amongst themselves. I don't know why people, if they see anything, why it doesn't report as much. But I feel like the discussion happens, if not the same, as more. But I mean, just because of the size. And that's kind of, we all really know each other.
Yeah, so now we want to turn it over to you guys to be able to ask questions of each other. And I know Travis had emailed us his questions, so we're going to start with you to direct to the panel.
Let's see if I can remember the question. So I think my question was essentially directed at the students on the panel, just asking, what can we do collectively to, I guess, inspire students to take more responsibility on their own, individual responsibility to avoid these kind of behaviors, one, and two, how do we also incent them to actually intervene and not be a passive bystander, but really actively intervene and stop these kinds of activities?
So, to your first point, I would say kind of just breaking, I know you and I had this conversation last week about how to break the cycle. Just because it happened to you doesn't mean you have to perpetuate it. I feel that's a certain thing is that if someone was hazed, they feel, oh, I went through this rite of passage, as someone on the panel said, and then this person also has to go through it. Kind of breaking that cycle that you can still accomplish the same goals through different methods. And that's to say you don't have to do everything that was done to you. Sometimes I feel like in order to break the cycle of hazing, we need to change the way we go about it. Kind of encouraging people to change the way, change what happened to them by behaving differently towards someone else. Because continuing the cycle, you're not doing much of anything, but just talking to someone. I got to think about the second part.
How do we encourage individuals to take part, be more responsible for themselves?
I think I can actually take this from Vice President Murphy, but she kind of suggested that maybe we start talking to, maybe even before people kind of go through the formal recruitment process of entering Greek life, is that we have leaders kind of sit down with them and explain to them that this is not only kind of our expectations of their behavior when they do join this community, but this is also kind of a promise that we make to you that you don't have to go through such processes, and that, even if it is an isolated incident, or if you do feel as though this is, that you are going through something that would constitute hazing, is that you do have allies, not only within your chapter, but also kind of on, the larger governance level, where you can come forward. And that, again, is just kind of having conversations like this to kind of just, make the community aware that there is leadership willing to stand up and say that this is not okay for our system.
I'd just like to make a quick comment. Every year when we have new freshmen transfers come to Cornell University to participate in athletics, I meet with the entire group, and I'm joined by a number of other professionals. In fact, Travis is there every year, and we have professors speak about plagiarism, and we touch on a lot of different notes. And one of the things that I state very clearly to every freshman transfer athlete is that they never ever have to do something that makes them feel uncomfortable, unless it happens to be an extra wind sprint or something like that. But I let them know that in all seriousness, if something comes up that you can just feel that it's inappropriate, please alert me. But also please know that there will be no retaliation. I will make sure that none of the athletes or none of the members of the coaching staff or anybody that's involved with you or your program will react in a way that makes you not want to speak up. And I'm crystal clear about this, and I say as bluntly as I can so that they know that they don't have to do anything, and that they can be providing a terrific service to the department, the university, and to our administration if they have the courage to step forward and let us know that something is about to go on or something is going on, so that we can put an end to it. And the objective isn't to be heavy with people and nasty and come down so hard that there's a fear factor, but just let people understand that times have changed, and it's not part of our program, and we're not going to tolerate it, and we're going to get rid of it. And but make sure that the younger folks that join programs understand that they have support above the coaching staff, above their captains, above their peers, and they don't have to do something that they're uncomfortable doing.
Are there any other questions that are directly for the panelists? Okay, I have a question for the entire panel, and it's kind of going back to something that Dean Akar said about goofiness and hazing and kind of wearing outfits. So because hazing is something that happens throughout societies around the world and has happened historically, at what point do we find hazing problematic? So if it is something goofy, is that necessarily bad? Because it is an alternative to doing something dangerous. So, at what point is that problematic for the university and for students?
I'd be happy to answer. We love in academia to say research shows. Well, the research that we did in our survey was that if an individual did stupid, nonsensical, buffoonery in public, that was an indication that they were doing dangerous things in private, that there was a correlation there. That if the community accepted that type of behavior, where the guys dress up as the female cheerleaders and stand in the cafeteria on the table and sing the school fight song, that was an indication that most likely they were doing something far more dangerous behind closed doors in the basement of some house, because the school didn't react. Now that everyone has a camera on their cell phone that's connected to all sorts of social media, all those images are going to be plastered everywhere. So the school has an obligation to respond immediately. The athletic director was talking about the standards for teams. If any of you are from New York, you may have heard of SUNY Geneseo and their women's volleyball team. That a student was coming back from an off-campus hazing ritual where they were given vast quantities of alcohol. She passed out, her friends left her there, and a lot of the information that they got initially was through Facebook and through Twitter. And just so the athletic director knows, the media immediately went to the coach's Facebook page and plastered her image across all the local TV stations, and her Facebook page was her flipping people off. So that was the image of SUNY Geneseo and their athletic program that all the population got to see, which is far contrary to really what they stand for. So the image that people present, that's stupid, that's silly, really has to be addressed. It can't go on and just be accepted as being, boys being boys, or just college, stupid stuff.
I guess the question is, if from the student side, it seems like the university is cracking down on hazing from the stupid buffoonery all the way to the stuff that's endangering people's health. How, when Travis had asked this question, how is the university going to be able to gain the trust of students if it seems from the student end that the university is cracking down on everything, including the stuff that, let's say, the organization and the people who are being hazed support and enjoy and find what you would say, fun and exciting. How can you have both, basically?
Yeah. I'll see if I can come to that, but let me respond to the original question. And Dan, you know that I really like the word trust. So let's look at it a different way. If we're asking somebody to dress up in some sort of costume and go act ridiculous, to most people that may sound really harmless and maybe even fun. But we don't know if everybody who agrees to do it actually feels that way, because they want to join these organizations, right? I mean, people go through extraordinary measures to join a fraternity, sorority, to maintain their membership on a team, to get into another organization, an honor society. They will go through extraordinary measures. And so some people would say, well, isn't that the point? We want them to prove themselves. But does that really align with what that organization or club says it's about? And so are we somehow placing people in really, at least, uncomfortable positions, if not mentally dangerous positions at times, based on what we're asking them to do? And of course they're doing it because they really want to join. So if you look at it from that perspective, okay, the silly outfit sounds like it's not a problem, but it could be. I mean, we just don't know the kinds of experiences somebody has had in their life prior to coming to a place like Cornell. And we might be placing them in a situation that really rekindles a very emotional experience that they've had. And it doesn't seem to me that anybody really wants to place their friend or their potential brother or sister in that situation, but we haven't thought it through. And that's why it's important to keep in mind what Dean Pollard was talking about in terms of what are the healthy kinds of activities to accomplish the legitimate goals of orienting new members into any of our groups or teams. And that's the piece that why we stick to, here's the line, and the line seems like it may be on the side of things that most of us may see as not physically harmful, but we have to take into consideration somebody else's perspective and background and how it could be harmful in other ways.
Thank you guys so much. We want to bring on the drinking panel now, and then the audience will have the ability to ask questions to both panels. Feel free to grab some coffee, cookies as we shuffle around a bit, but thank you guys.
Hi everyone, we're just going to get started, so when you have a chance, you can take a seat and calm down and get your cookies, don't worry. So we're going to just reintroduce this panel. We have Adam Gitlin, President of the Student Assembly, Bill Shaw of Shaw Law Firm, Chris Sanders, Interfraternity Council President, Don Schrader, who is a communications professor here, and Tim Marshall. Sorry, we will begin. Well, my first question is for you. According to Gannett, 45% of students binge drink. This is based on the definition that binge drinking entails 4 drinks in one sitting for a female and 5 for a male. Most students would not describe the aforementioned as binge drinking. How do students and administrators work together towards a meaningful solution if their definitions are so disparate? And this came from an online question.
So the first thing I'd like to clarify is that we actually avoid using the term binge drinking because binge drinking in clinical terms historically is a reflection of a much higher level than this 4 or 5 figure, which is in the press often referred to as, quote, binge drinking. We refer to the 4 or 5 measure as high-risk drinking because that's based on statistical probabilities. If an individual, if a female drinks 4 drinks in a sitting or a male drinks 5 drinks in a sitting, the odds are that they will experience some negative consequence from that. Now, that doesn't mean they automatically will. There's variations in blood alcohol contents that are achieved depending on body size. So if you're 250 pounds, if you're a 250-pound male and you have 5 drinks over 4 hours, your blood alcohol content is not going to reach the legal limit for intoxication. So it's relative risk. Now, in terms of reaching common ground about the language that we use, I think that the important thing to focus on is the harm that is caused by drinking. So whether you draw the cutoff at 4, 5, or 8 and 11, or wherever it might be, I think that we all share a concern about drinking that leads to people being transported to the hospital with alcohol poisoning, individuals who are blacking out from drinking, individuals who are impaired to the point where they're causing disruption to other people, damaging property, interfering with people's sleep or their studying. These are the kinds of negative consequences to individual drinkers themselves and to other members of the community that I think we need to be focusing on.
So is binge drinking a term that we should just strike from the discussion altogether because it's not necessarily the best way to reflect what's going on?
It's shorthand language, and sometimes it slips into the conversations. I think high risk is really the term to be focusing on. Sometimes researchers will refer to it as heavy episodic drinking. This is a very jargony kind of approach to this, but it's really drinking that causes harm.
Now, talking about the terminology that's used, whether you describe it as binge drinking or high risk drinking, if I'm having 4 or 5 drinks in a night, and I don't see, let's say, any of the negative side effects, whether it's regarding studying or blacking out or something like that, how is the university going to be able to reach me, let's say, and how do you kind of create a common dialogue that both people are on the same page if it seems like there's kind of 2 definitions of what the reality of high risk drinking, and then a wide variety of the way people and students react to drinking?
Well, I'd approach that from 2 perspectives. One is that when you're talking to an individual about his or her drinking, then the question is, what's the impact on you of whatever level that you're drinking at? And so someone could be drinking 2 drinks and have negative consequences. Others could be drinking at higher levels and not have negative consequences. The issue, but from a broader perspective, is how do we as a community think about this? How do we have a conversation and work together to identify ways to reduce drinking patterns that typically cause problems to individuals and those around them? And so I think the focus on the harm and also the drinking that we typically see that comes in to play, so that if there are drinking games or chugging hard alcohol, these kinds of things are very predictable in terms of generating harm, and I think that's where we need to focus the conversation.
The next question is for Adam Gitlin. The essay and yourself are putting forth this new effort about Cayuga's Watchers. What does this entail, and how do you feel this will be effective in preventing binge drinking or high-risk drinking?
Sure. So Cayuga's Watchers, if people haven't read about it, is a new program which is a peer-to-peer social intervention program where Cornell students are going to be paid to go to social events, and they're going to be trained or taught to look out for signs of high-risk drinking, signs of alcohol poisoning, or even signs of sexual misconduct. And the idea is that when you have students and really friends who are looking out for friends, there's going to be a cultural change within the student body. If you, for example, have And say, just for example, the Cornell Daily Sun is having a social event, and the program would actually employ people within the Daily Sun to monitor each other. So the idea behind it is that it's students standing up against, very risky behavior. It's not trying to end drinking, but it's a harm reduction model so that students who have drinking too much, maybe won't necessarily go to the hospital, or if students are sick, that, proper medical care is called. And, as I sort of mentioned earlier, it's going to be more of a grassroots effort. It's not necessarily coming from the student assembly, and it's certainly not coming from the administration. The idea is that friends are going to be looking out for friends.
I have a question about kind of the operational aspects of this. So, say someone is hired, what exactly is the protocol with their intervention? Like, what are they physically doing at this engagement? And additionally, how do we make sure they're actually effective if they're not getting paid to go out?
If I'm a Cayugas watcher, what do I do? How am I going to stop you or anybody else from high-risk drinking? What's like the step-by-step, if that makes sense?
Sure. So it is basically if you have students going to social events who are under contract with Cayugas Watchers. It's a non-confrontational approach. So if they see that a student is stumbling around and is about to go grab a handle of vodka to take another shot, they'll go up to that student and engage them in conversation. Because a lot of the time, students who are already at that point will not even realize that they're even drinking more. They'll just continue drinking because that's sort of part of the mindset, and they won't realize that they've already had enough to drink, that they're not even, the positive aspects of drinking or like the utility or that people think it's fun, they don't even realize that they're no longer getting more out of it. That in fact, just negative ramifications are setting in. So they'll go up to them and engage them in conversation. And really it also depends on what the organizational leadership wants, because it's a program where fraternity presidents, sorority presidents, student organizations, it's not only a Greek program, will say to Cayugas Watchers, we want watchers at our social event, and they can choose what services they want. If they want watchers to go around every 15 minutes to check the bathrooms to make sure that students aren't passed out or vomiting, that would be part of it. If they want students to be near the door just to look out and make sure that really drunk individuals aren't already coming in, then that will be part of that service. The last part, and then, sorry that was a long answer, is that a part of it is that it's going to be within the reporting structure of the fraternity or the student organization. They're not here as police, as a judicial force. They're just extra sets of eyes and ears for the organizational leadership, so that if they do see a student who is sick, they'll go to the fraternity president or the organization president and evaluate the situation from there.
Thank you. Do you want to respond?
I think my experience as well working with Adam quite closely in regards to Cayugas Watchers, I think one thing that Adam kind of downplayed also with what is so exciting about it in my eyes is the fact that we're really looking to try to find the socially influential sort of leaders within different organizations to be taking the role of the Cayugas Watchers. And so as of now, over the last 2 years, I've had experiences with leadership within the Greek system, both on the systematic level and also within the chapter level. And one thing that we've noticed is that there's kind of a range of spectrum of behavior that exhibits within, or exists within the fraternity. That you have, your top, 10% who are the student leaders that have the nominal positions, your presidents, executive board members, and then there tends to be the majority of the fraternity or the organization, whether or not it's Greek or otherwise, that is really the silent minority, or the silent majority, excuse me, that makes up the majority of the the participants within the organization. 80 to 90% of the organization, has good intentions, is really not inclined to be leading the deviant behavior, which is unfortunately what most oftentimes is reflected within news headlines. It's those behaviors that are the deviant, that are high risk, really are only come from a small segment of the population of any organization. However, because the majority is silent and the minority unfortunately has an outweighed voice within the organization, there becomes a sense of collective status quo of not speaking out, to not call each other. And I think what's really interesting about the Kegels Watchers is the fact that they're really trying to find those people that are the social leaders that don't necessarily have the position titles. They're the people within the organizations that people look up to, that people respect, that they really want to be able to use them as leverage to kind of break the status quo of not acting as an active bystander. And I think one of the things in a class I'm taking with Professor Bill Sonnenstall, we talk a lot about, we're doing some research about figuring out why are there these problems and what ways can we work to address these issues of alcohol abuse within the different organizations on campus. And a lot of the research that I've done within this class has been looking at more of these silent student leaders within the organizations. And one of the largest things that they repetitively keep saying, throughout all the conversations, is that the reason why they don't intervene, even though the majority of times they do feel as though they should intervene, is because it's not in their place. They feel as though that they're going to face social consequences, and especially ostracization, because they don't have the support of the majority of people. The people that they continuously are the ones that would need to be telling to, ask to, put down the glass, are the ones that are tending to be the more outspoken, deviant sorts of leaders. And so what I think is really interesting about this is that by trying to find the social leaders within the different organizations and bringing them together, it's really trying to combat that status quo. And I think that if we really want to see change regarding alcohol, first of all, bystander intervention needs to be welcomed, then it needs to be accepted, and finally, it needs to be expected. And that's what I think that we're trying to get to the point of, and that's what I think Kegels Watchers really does have an important place within this community, because we're first of all trying to get to that point of being welcomed, then accepted, and we're still a long ways away from being expected. But that's what needs to happen. There's a common expectation that it's a social norm across campus that this high-risk behavior isn't welcome, it's not expected here. And unfortunately, at this time, that's not where we're at, but we're trying to get there. And I think Kegels Watchers really, can play an important role in moving our culture towards that, model.
Thanks, Chris. Now we have a question for Professor Schrader. So your research is mainly about ethics and action and education. So I guess with a program like Kegels Watchers, how do we most instill this kind of bystander intervention, and when is it ethical for one student to intervene with another student's actions?
Well, I think these are really important questions to ask. And I really support what Chris and Adam are doing in terms of talking about ways in which we can work with each other to change the community and have the people who are leaders in the organizations to really lead that charge. One of the things that I am concerned about a little bit with this is as you were talking about, Chris, with the research, there's other research on diffusion of responsibility. And I think probably what could occur if we overly rely upon paid people to be responsible for intervention is that we will diffuse the responsibility from ourselves and recognize that you may think that other people should be responsible for helping your friends or helping people that you see are in need. So I think one of the things that we really need to inform our community about and really focus awareness on is to really look at the kinds of responsibility that each and every one of us has for our friends, and also for the responsibility that we have for each other. One thought that occurred to me when I was invited to be on this panel, and one of the messages that I would like to present today, is the idea that I'd like to have us all focus on prevention intervention. So if you could really begin to think about how is it that we could stop our friends and ourselves from overindulging in the first place, I think that would be the number one place to start. Okay, so what that may be is to set some limits before you go out. You can recognize from your past behavior what are your own personal limits, and as Tim was talking about in terms of the size and your own capability for processing alcohol. We recognize that not everyone is going to not drink when they go out. We understand the process of social life and social engagement, but to be responsible in that, and then prevent the situation from occurring. The other thing is that we want to really be concerned about putting our friends in a difficult position. Tim also mentioned the idea of perspective taking. Travis was talking about this as well in the last panel. Put yourself in another person's shoes. Really kind of see, do you really want to put your friend in a position of feeling responsible for your safety and well-being, and even for your own life? So really think about what are you asking your friends to do for you? And the other component of this too is to really follow your own instincts. Within the field of moral psychology, we're moving in a direction of not thinking so much about kind of this deliberative, rational decision-making process, which of course is important, okay? But one of the other things is that we all need to follow our gut instincts. There's something that inside of us that tells us what is the right thing to do or what is the wrong thing to do in a situation. So pay attention to that, use that as information to then go about thinking about what should I do when I see a friend or even someone I don't even know in a difficult situation. Your gut will pretty much tell you, well, I think I ought to help the person. And then sometimes our mind tells us, oh, well, it's going to take too much time, or it's going to be too much effort, or am I going to get in trouble if I'm associated with this? But essentially, most of us are really ethical, moral people, and we should follow that instinct and help one another, and also develop a community that's supportive of that kind of helping.
Now, is there a tangible way to instill all this without just kind of hoping that people are going to be preventative and look out for their friends and be ethical and moral? Like, how do you actually get people to do this? Because I think, the stuff you mentioned is incredibly important. It's stuff that everybody in this room would probably agree with and say, yes, it's important to be a good friend. It's important to think ahead about the way you're drinking. It's important to be ethical. But how do you actually translate from A to B? What's like the proven way that ethical bystander?
And just to add to that, kind of the way we address alcohol education, and is that in place, like with alcohol wise, for example?
Okay, those are good questions. And Dan, there is no proven way to translate judgment to action. If someone could do that, they would win sort of the Nobel Peace Prize, right? But I think what we need to do is we need to really think about the ways in which we all can be role models for one another, right? So I think that's one of the positive aspects of the program of Cayuga's Watchers is taking the kinds of people who are leaders within organizations and having them as the role models for each other. So that's one of the ways. I think the president has really created an amazing campaign on creating this the language and providing the opportunity for people to talk about themselves as being part of a caring community, that we should notice and respond. All of these campaigns would really help us to remind us to take care of one another. So it's the educative process of creating a language, creating some little signs, little reminders that we need to be responsible to each other, and we need to develop a community.
Yeah.
I would just also note that a strategy like the Good Samaritan policy, formerly known as medical ambulance protocol, even the messages that we were putting out around this policy and the New York State law is that when someone is passed out from too much alcohol, when it's a medical emergency, we want people to do the right thing. Do the right thing. So there's really a moral message that's embedded in this policy, that we have responsibilities towards each other and for the welfare of each other, even if we don't know the other person.
So this question is for Bill. and actually came from an online submission. And the person wrote, does the administration think excluding freshmen from the Greek life social scene will reduce drinking? In your opinion, was this a move by the university effective, or does this kind of just shift responsibility off their shoulders altogether?
Like so many of your questions, it's about 4 questions, 3 of which are to the administration, which I am not a part of. I've got 3 degrees here, but I'm not part of the administration. If I can perhaps rephrase the tone of the question, the focus of the question, you all live in an era where it's illegal to drink until you're 21. And it's interesting as you sit here in every one of these panels, there's kind of an assumption that the vast majority of you are drinking flat out illegal. And I do presentations at fraternities and sororities and have for decades on that very point. How do you sort out the risks that you're willing to take? As to whether the administration's actions have been effective, that really is impossible to answer because the administration has acted in so many ways. And some of those are effective, some of those we don't know yet. Travis would be the first to acknowledge that many of these things are new efforts that are going to take years to change. Changing culture doesn't happen by passing some dictum. But I also think the tone of the question is perhaps directed to me, because I do represent some 20 or 30 fraternities, even a half dozen more sororities, is to what extent are certain university actions which have imposed greater restrictions, greater enforcement, greater consequences on fraternities and sororities, driven the actions elsewhere. If that's the question, the answer would be, I believe it has. I believe that that may be an acceptable consequence if you're the university. They have their own responsibility. They have to worry about their own liability. They are the defendants in lawsuits, just as individual fraternities and sororities are, or individuals who provide the alcohol or fail to do an adequate job. But as to whether it's effective or not, I do think that we may have lost the balance of also the educational consequence. And as I look across the board and see some of the consequences being imposed on fraternities and sororities, whether it's intended or not, I do believe they tend to be disciplinary. Immediate suspension. A lot of publicity over that. Maybe down the road, it turns out the facts were wrong. It turns out it wasn't even an individual here on our campus. These are disturbing for these groups and the members of the groups to kind of instantly be cast as if they are committing crimes, which they did, or committing atrocities, when, as you mentioned, it may have been buffoonery. I do think that there needs to be a greater balance in educational consequences. So, for example, a fraternity or a sorority take on leadership in the area of alcohol education, take on leadership in the area of where's the line between proper pledging and seeking achievements before you get admitted to an organization, be it a sorority or a football team or what have you. And if you fail to do that, then maybe part of the consequence would be peer education. It would be both educational for the individuals who may have stepped over the line, as well as what you guys are talking about, which is vital, absolutely vital, and that's peer-to-peer communication, something that everybody on the panel would agree we can never do. We are no longer your peers. So there hopefully will be a blending, but I'm comfortable with the fact that there are swing and pendulum movements over the years. I attended Cornell for 8 years, and all of that time you could drink from age 18 on. I was even a townie when we would drink before we got here. That's changed. You've got to, on the one hand, accept that change. That's the law. Good luck with changing that. You probably won't. But you've also got to find a way to balance the risks, whether they be, as Tim has pointed out, the physical or the psychological risks or the impacts on your friends, or whether I'd be here to represent the legal risks, the consequences of that. The truth is, everybody will balance those risks on any given day, whether they drive 65 and a 55, whether they have 3 beers when they only should have had 1, whether they're driving buzzed as opposed to stone sober. They need to be aware of those risks, and maybe the administration could do a better job when they go over the line to having the consequences be more educational and less immediate in either suspension, tragic consequences on individual students, tens of thousands of dollars in life disruption. And later they may turn out to be either innocent or only going to remind the thing. The same with the fraternities and sororities that I represent. The suspension, which is often for weeks or months before it gets sorted out, can have tens, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars of consequences to empty houses like in Randolph and Ames that are empty and may never come back. Maybe there's a better way to get those organizations involved in the education of the other organizations. Quite frankly, I'll bet it's going on, and maybe we just need to see more of it.
Now, from your end, representing different fraternities on campus, with the moves that have been made in the last 3, 4, 5 years, are individual fraternities more liable legally now than they were maybe 5 years ago?
Well, that's easy. The answer would be yes. First of all, psychologically and socially and politically, we're in a tragic post-George J. Doolan era. And everybody in this room either knows who George was, knew him personally, and knows what a tragedy that was. But unfortunately, that's the nature of our experience right here on our campus very recently. The absolute most tragic results that we can, and it affected all of us in various ways. And as a consequence, there is bound to be that swing of the pendulum saying we've got to find a way. Quite frankly, we should have found a way before. Quite frankly, there are a lot of unique circumstances there. One of the things that doesn't get addressed enough, the city judge, after a lengthy hearing, found the defendants not guilty. There isn't enough discussion about why and how that happened. But back to your question, the answer is yes, there is a higher liability. The university is very concerned, and I can see that in all kinds of their actions, to take stronger, more aggressive, more immediate actions. They don't want to be the defendant in a lawsuit, and they certainly don't want to be the losing defendant in a lawsuit. And we will see lawsuits whenever there is a loss or harm to life.
Sorry. We have one question left, and it's for Chris Sanders. The university decided to remove freshmen from fraternity parties last year. Has this been effective in kind of changing the drinking culture at Cornell, or is this pushing that dangerous activity elsewhere?
I think that what you've witnessed, and I think a lot of the students in this room can definitely attest that I think that there has been a drastic shift in the social culture. I'm sure everybody is familiar with the open party system that was, essentially ran first semester of Cornell, up until even our sophomore year as seniors that were here can still remember. And on any given weekday night throughout the course of the fall semester, there'd be hundreds, of students that would go to individual fraternities, probably have 7 to 8 different events every weekend. And definitely over the last 2 years, that has definitely changed. That isn't part of the social scene anymore. However, regarding the issues of freshmen at fraternities, one of the things that we do see is that freshmen continue to go to fraternities. However, it's been in a different form. Instead of going as a large open parties, it's been much more small, invite only, where there'd be a handful of freshmen that are invited to come. And so, in some degrees, yes, there has been change, but in actually reducing the amount of freshmen and having freshmen not be attending at all, I don't necessarily has been that effective. And I think that the IFC Executive Board have taken a stance in which that we need to be able to balance the issues. We've had plenty of conversations. I'm sure Tim and Adam can attest to this with what balance do we have in ensuring the safety of students and having registered events. That's one of our biggest concerns as an executive board, is that we want to continue to see people have these registered events, because when it's registered, it can be regulated. But whenever it moves off campus or into college town, you lose that sense of regulation. As fraternity executive, we don't have jurisdiction over those events. Yes, there's still our chapters, but we don't have the ability to send the SRC to these areas to oversee. So I think that's one of the concerns that I definitely have seen, and I think that it's been a common sentiment within the conversations with the Dartmouth Collaborative team is how effective have these policies actually been at reducing the harm and actually increasing safety of the students. But so I think it's kind of convoluted that there has been change, but not as much change as I think that we would like to see.
What kind of change do you think would be more? Sorry, what kind of change do you think would be more effective and not enough change? So
yeah, like most of the questions we had gotten that were given to us were along the lines of, well, if freshmen are going in smaller groups to fraternity parties, one, like, where are they going, and has this become safer or has it become more dangerous, and what do we do about that? So.
And I think that's yet to really be seen. I think that one of the things that we've started to see at the beginning of the semester, we had 5 to 6 weeks of very low numbers of judicial referrals or medical incidences. However, what we've seen is that it seems as though that fraternities had found ways in which that they could operate around the rules, that they had found ways in which that they could find ways to invite freshmen. But while they were, for the first 5 to 6 weeks, what it seems anecdotally from the judicial hearings that we've had is that they were taking much more precaution when they had freshmen over. They were, like Will was saying, that there was this risk. You go 65 and a 55, and people were hedging on that. People were being very cognizant of the fact that people were looking, that the administration had heightened their attention regarding freshmen at the events. However, what seems to have happened is that people became complacent and complicit in the fact that they felt as though that they could get around the rules, that nothing had happened, that they had experienced 6 weeks. And I think what we've seen recently, when we had a conversation with fraternity presidents last night, that people, have become, hesitant in following and enforcing their own rules and creating a safe environment for these, freshmen. And unfortunately, what we started to see is because of that, there has been an uptick in, judicial incidences within the system, and there's been an uptick within, medical issues as well. And it was, we've given the opportunity for fraternity leadership to prove that they're responsible at ensuring the safety and having, safe events. And unfortunately, it seems as though recently that they haven't been able to prove that they're capable of that. And what you'll see is that because of that, we, the IFC, we are a judicial body. We're not a policing body. That one, an incident does happen, we will take the appropriate and steps to ensure that. So that's kind of the stance that we're at right now.
I might supplement that briefly with a comment you asked me earlier, and I realized I omitted one key thing to the extent that university policies may impose consequences. One that everybody in this room is familiar with, we see a big increase in pre-gaming. And we have also lost the ability, for all the criticism there is of the Greeks, which are basically small living units, choose to live together. For all the criticism, they get a lot of front page, and they certainly have this week. On the other hand, they are supervised, regulated. Every time they have an event, the information is made available to local police, local fire. They come there, so there's a spotlight on them. So there is a balancing there, because if we're driving into pre-gaming, which is definitely dangerous, uncontrolled, and then you don't know that, to off-campus into the annexes, and I fear that we're going to see some of that with both the criminal consequences, which my office sees, as well as civil.
Thank you guys so much. We want to just turn it to the audience if anybody has questions for both this panel and the earlier Hazing panel.
We can, and any panelists can just come up and we can give up our seats.
Yeah, so. Go for it.
This is a question for Dean Apgar. It seems like, specifically when Hollis was speaking, like the difference in hazing incidents between the sorority system and the fraternity system seems to be pretty great. In that if if the largest issue to sororities is these rotational dinners in which members are already initiated and from my experience have been, well not have been, but are voluntarily participating, that seems very different to me than what has been called lineups, and it occurs when you are still in the pledging process, and that seems like a much larger deal and much bigger problem to me. And so I'm trying to kind of see the kind of work around what appears as a double standard between sororities and fraternities, where sororities are being prosecuted for hazing in these rotational dinners, versus these fraternities that are being held to the lowest standards and being prosecuted only occasionally for lineups for students who are sent to the hospital or worse. So I'd like to hear from you what you think about that. If you can suggest to me that that's not a double standard, I would love to hear why.
So that's a lot. I'm not sure. I'm going to try to figure out exactly which part you think is a double standard. But let me just start by saying that hazing is defined as any activity you would ask of somebody or expect of somebody, regardless of whether or not they're a member or they're joining the organization, that would be either a explicit or implicit requirement of maintaining or gaining their membership, regardless of a person's willingness to participate, that might place them in danger either mentally or physically. So that's kind of a rough definition, okay? But the point is that hazing is no more serious or less serious based on a person's official status as a member or joining member. The person's willingness to participate really doesn't enter into the equation. So even if they're willing, doesn't make it any more or less hazing. And I would just say that you have to, because the term rotational, I think applies to a lot of different things. I think the term lineup actually applies to many different things as well. So you can look at the spectrum of lineups where one is you ask your new members to come over and you're quizzing them, and it's actually a fairly collegiate environment or academic environment, as opposed to the lineup where you're in the basement and you're screaming and yelling and there's a lot of verbal and mental abuse happening and perhaps forced calisthenics while you're forcing them to drink alcohol. Those are really different lineups, right? Same can be said about rotationals. Sometimes rotationals have been described to me as literally the older members of a sorority who were study abroad or weren't around in their junior year are now back, and they literally are just inviting the newest members, who are generally sophomores, over to their apartment, and they have dinner, and maybe they drink, but it's all kind of, you know, wine with dinner, not expected forced alcohol consumption or again, verbal abuse or mental abuse. And so if you look at those cases over the past few years of sororities that have been found responsible for hazing through some sort of rotational, it doesn't look so different from the lineup at a fraternity that we would all agree is hazing. There's verbal abuse, there's mental abuse, there's an expectation because you're a younger member that you have to prove yourself worthy to the older member. And so these are pretty comparable kinds of examples that have been enforced over the last few years to fraternities and sororities. I suspect that if you look at the number of fraternities and the number of sororities, you know, I haven't done the math, but maybe by percentage there's some equity there. We'd have to look. But you know, so I hope that helps you understand that piece. You know, in terms of having a different expectation for fraternities and sororities, I don't believe the system does. I think that the judicial board system and the review board system tries to apply, I think, standards across all three councils, regardless of whether it's a Panhellenic sorority and a fraternity council fraternity, or one of the three sub-councils of Multicultural Greek Letter Council. And I think there actually was a question earlier when the hazing panel was up here about something to do with, you know, lower numbers of people reporting in the MGLC, and so there aren't as much available information to act on. But if you actually look at the history of hazing cases over the past decade, I think you'll find that there are actually a number from all three councils, and so we try to apply the same standard across the board. With that said, there are very different policies that exist from the national level that Panhellenic, the National Panhellenic Conference may have and expect to be imposed on the Panhellenic sororities versus the North American Fraternity Conference, or versus the three different sub-councils of the Multicultural Greek Letter Council. And so there is sometimes some difference in how impactful, I suppose, the sanctions are, but that's controlled more at a national level, those independent organizations, than it is how we on our campus apply the policies.
I think this also kind of goes to the nature of the Panhellenic Nationals tends to be a lot more responsive and more severe in terms of if the sorority goes to J board or review board, as opposed to kind of, and again, since there are more national IFC organizations, you tend to get more of a spectrum in terms of how they respond to a judicial board complaint or a review board complaint. And so since a J board hearing automatically results kind of in a national notification. You tend to have once you have a sorority going either to J board or to review board, you tend to get kind of a more, I wouldn't say severe, but kind of a more tangible impact because of just the national notification.
Any other questions? Yeah, Nick.
I got a question for Professor Newer. And so when I think about hazing, the types of activities that get characterized as hazing, I think their general purpose is to, one, help to form a bond between a group of people that are becoming new members of this organization, and two, is to help them grow as a person. And something that's been brought up a few times is that hazing is something that makes these new members uncomfortable. And so how can we expect people to sort of grow as people in their becoming members of an organization without going outside of their comfort zones?
One of the challenges that you have when you bring new members into an organization is you don't know a lot about who they are. They know more about you, your values, what's on your website, what you espouse, what makes you unique, whether it be a Greek letter organization or an athletic team or an honor society. They know something about you that gives meaning and something that's attractive to them. So when you create a process that you think is reflective of your organization, that says this is the process that we're going to have to welcome you, to initiate you, to make you one of us, it has to fit. And when you're using things that's dangerous or humiliating, is that really reflective of your values? When we did our survey, we found that 15% of those who were hazed said that they quit the organization because of that experience. So you could have maybe one of the best basketball players on the team that could really push you to that next level, who chooses to drop off the team because they were hazed. The second piece that we found is that an equal number, 15%, wanted revenge as a byproduct of being hazed in your organization. How that works out is that you may have done something you thought was done to you that was pretty innocuous, thought it was okay. They go through that process. It has an impact that you didn't necessarily want them to experience, but nonetheless, they're now part of your organization. And as Tim has chronicled on his website here, there are many students that will ratchet up a notch and make it that much more difficult, that much more humiliating, that much more dangerous to the next group of pledges or initiates. So by 3 or 4 years, you could have a system that's far different than your initial expectations for joining. So that's that twist, that you're imposing something that isn't reflective of your organization, that could have unexpected consequences that really don't have anything to do with who you are or what you're about. Does that answer that? Maybe?
Yeah, Chris, you can respond.
We also want to just encourage, feel free to ask follow-up questions after your question as well. So.
Yeah, I think just a response to this question as well, I think looking at my experience coming into the Greek system, my experience is a little different from most people at Cornell as I joined at University of Denver my freshman year before transferring to Cornell. And I look at my experience, and it was, like you said, it was an experience that put me out of my comfort zone. And I think that to some, with the broad definition of what hazing is, that there were some parts of it that probably would be determined, to be hazing, just because it is such an overarching broad term. But I think that there's things that people need to understand is that you can achieve that same end of putting people outside their comfort zone in a positive sort of way. And I think what people is most troubling for me is to see that too often times do these the hazing exercises become demeaning, dehumiliating, and are incredibly harmful to the individual. And I don't think that necessarily there can be a process in which you can really encourage personal growth and development. And I look at my experience as being one of the most positive and formative experiences that I've been through. But not at once did I feel like I found myself being put in a situation where I felt, I was at mental harm or, at physical risk. So I think that people need to understand that we sometimes need to break from these traditions that it's hard to do because it is so ingrained, and understand that there are multiple means to the same end. And I think that too oftentimes people aren't willing to take on and understand that there are multiple ways to do it. I think that's just one thing that people need to encourage and be encouraged to do more, is to really think about like what other ways can we encourage growth within an organizational context, because I think that's what everybody joins an organization, especially here at Cornell, where college, we're also growing and developing, especially within a community that is as large as Cornell's. With 14,000 undergrads, it's hard to find some community, and that's what one of the biggest benefits of these organizations are to so many people, that it provides a space in which it takes this large institution and makes it small. It provides a home, it provides a sense of community. But there has to be ways in which that we can find ways to bring people into this organization that aren't, dehumanizing and, harmful to, that's not a word, humiliating and stuff like that. So I think it's just, be mindful, and I think it take advantage of the opportunity that you presented, that you really can create new traditions and break from old.
And I think we talked a little bit about social norms today, and I think this relates to hazing and definitely high-risk drinking. I think that most people would be, in fraternities, in organizations, in sororities, would be surprised that, if you were to quiz people in the organizations, many more people are actually don't think that these practices are healthy or positive. And last year, I met with the Meinig Scholars, which are a group of freshmen at Cornell who work on a project every year. And when they were quizzed about high-risk drinking, a very large number of them said that they, didn't think it was acceptable, didn't think it was healthy. But when they were then quizzed about what they think their friends and other people thought about high-risk drinking, they thought that everyone else thought it was okay. So it's a self-perpetuating sort of social norm for, both. I know there's statistics for high-risk drinking. I'm not sure about hazing, but I bet if the same test, happened, I think the statistics would reveal the same. But the idea is that more people than I think any of us can think are actually at an individual level aren't comfortable with a lot of these practices all around.
Next question is in the blue shirt. You.
All right, yeah. So kind of 2 points. I think it's important for you guys to distinguish between sports hazing and hazing in fraternities. I think they're inherently different. If you're going to look at Cornell, I feel like the biggest thing that you guys are facing is a problem with boredom. Fraternities are kind of made to create meaning. They're supposed to create a dialogue. We're spending 3 years together. Why do we do hazing in the first place? We're accelerating a relationship with people we maybe not have had a really close relationship with. And that's because we're creating relationships. We're creating something that's supposed to last longer than our college experience. If you're going to look at sports teams, I think it's a very different type of, I feel like that kind of falls more into the buffoonery, more into the revenge type of aspect. I'd be the first to say I was absolutely a product of hazing. I was a senior. I joined a house that was notorious for hazing. I wasn't scared about it. I don't regret anything that happened to me. And I think that's interesting. I think that's an important point. Because if you're going to look at a lot of the people that have issues and people are going to the hospital and are bringing all these issues, they're not really in this debate right now. The people that you're worried about aren't in this room. And I think the biggest failure of the degree system, and some of the things that I've been most frustrated by, isn't actually the hazing itself. When I finished my hazing experience or whatever, I had Dutch brothers that I honestly cared about. If you talk about Cayuga Watchers, I would have done anything for them at Dutch class. I cared about them. I cared about their well-being. I think the problem is that we were told once we joined these houses that they, stood for so much, and we had such a high expectations about what they stood for. And I think the biggest problem is once we actually became members, we really didn't have that much to do. You know, like there's partying, there's drinking, but you know, where was that higher meaning that we were told about when we were memorizing literature, when we were doing interviews? I mean, that just wasn't there. And so I think that's probably the biggest fault. You need to really look at focusing on students after they've joined. I think when you're going to look at kids who get into bad habits, it's because they're meeting these seniors and juniors who are bored and tired, and you know, when you have that, they tend to drugs or drinking, and they take those habits and they get it down to the younger initiates. You know, like I always tried to do the opposite. I never had a problem talking to people and, you know, making sure that people knew that it wasn't a big deal. But I feel like that groupthink mentality is more of a product of just this void of meaning that we have in the Greek organization. So if I don't even know how to deal with it, but I think one thing you could definitely do is be more open to, I guess, psychological, like being able to talk to people. You know, I think a lot of these people that have issues in these organizations, like yes, they'll binge drink, but binge drinking is a symptom of a much deeper issue that they would have. So, I mean, I think having more of an ed, you know, being able to talk to someone outside of, you know, a third-party perspective would be a really great way to deal with these issues. I don't, but like, these are like really intense issues, but I just wanted to talk about it in a more holistic approach.
We can get you guys the wireless mic. You guys can pass that around.
I guess as a response to your comments, one thing that MGLC or any fraternity or sorority that was founded to serve the community. We're all founded on general principles of leadership, service, brother and sister, all that stuff. But I feel that one thing that we in MGLC, I currently brought up that since we have 64 members, around 94 now with the new classes that came in, is that since we're so small, it's easier for us to directly serve the communities that we come from. We live in our communities so much that even without wearing our letters, walking around, people know that we're in a Greek-led organization. This is something that we live with our communities, and it's easier for us to see the issues that are prevalent in them. So I don't really see like MGLC, the boredom aspect, because we're always busy. And not just, given our chapters are so small, many of us hold multiple positions. Like I myself hold 4 positions in my chapter, because I have a chapter 2. So it comes down to, we're not necessarily bored, and I feel like there may be other reasons why hazing is prevalent within MGLC, but in terms of that boredom aspect, I don't see that as a problem within MGLC, and I'm pretty sure within the leadership of the other councils, they're not bored, and it's kind of like, it's the general mass, like you said, the groupthink mentality of all the members in the chapter that kind of go through this whole thing.
I mean, just kind of as a response, I'm just saying that hazing is not inherently the issue as much as it is what happens to these students after they've joined the organization and they don't have a lot of constructive things to do. So, you know, like I think you were mentioning like how, you know, your organization is much smaller. I mean, for a lot of these people, you know, I'm in a fraternity, I mix with like a select group of stories, hang out with a select group of people. You're talking about a very close-off community in itself, whether it's within a fraternity or just like 3 or 4 fraternities that you're friends with. So, I mean, that's a huge problem that I think Cornell in general faces, is that we're, you know, self-segregating ourselves, and there's a price that we have to pay to that. You know, I think one thing you could definitely do is we should definitely work with the chapters, and, you know, like we think of, I feel like the problem is that we take like all the literature and all the things that these chapters talk about, and we group them together with the idea of hazing. But like, if you're going to try and find some type of protocol to like give these chapters something else to talk about, something else to stand for, it should be within the hazing process that initially happened. You know, like if they're talking about, you know, service, justice, learning, you know, those are the principles of our fraternity, and we do have a lot of that, and there's so many good aspects. I think it's important to like wade through the good and bad, and you know, realize that there are a lot of parts about the hazing process. And I'm saying hazing broadly. I wouldn't classify what happened to me as hazing per se. But I mean, I think maybe looking at, we should look for more internal change, especially for these organizations that have been so closed off and they have such a like storied history that they're not going to be initially so open to like the administration or someone from like you as Waters initiating change?
Well, I think to go off of that, Akash, does Sigma Chi have a 4-year like education model, or is it just expected that you're supposed to learn everything in the first 8 weeks?
See, yeah, that's a good point.
So
I mean,
I think
yeah.
I think if most people are not familiar with RARE, and kind of was the task force put together to kind of respond to President Skorton's call to end pledging, and one of their recommendations is actually kind of transitioning both to a 4-year educational model, but also what you were kind of saying is that you don't want necessarily outsiders telling you, what should be in your new member education plan, and a big part of that is actually alumni engagement in approving your new member education plan. So just to respond to that.
Yeah, we want to just ask one more question because we know it's running late.
Unless
But
there were- I think there was
yeah, unless somebody else.
Does anyone else want to respond to that comment, question? Or do we?
Yeah, so we just we
John
want.
wants to respond.
I really do appreciate your comments. I think that there are so many components within what you are communicating. One of the things that I see as my training is in moral psychology is that as I go back to looking at the basic moral foundations of humanity, and one of those basic foundations is the sense of belonging. And we are all joining these organizations, whatever organizations they are, whether it's fraternities, sororities, or whatever special interest. You want to belong to some kind of group. It helps make your Cornell experience more personal and creates the bonds and friendships that will last you throughout your lifetime. And that's certainly something that's really an important part of your personal growth and development. But the question is, how is it that that bonding takes place? And the other question is, how quickly do we want to have those ties created? And many times people think that it's through this, this very strong ritualistic hazing that has many times, as Chris was saying, these kind of dehumanizing components to it, and degrading and humiliating aspects. And that's not really the kind of bond or friendship I think that most people wish that all of their relationships will be founded on for the rest of their lives, right? So why is it that in such an important component of your work within fraternities and sororities, that kind of bonding would be the way in which you create those bonds? And I think that's the kind of question that we would ask of you, is to really think about how are the best ways of bonding going to be achieved. And you talk about the service, justice, and learning. Let's do something that is something that reflects those kinds of missions. If there are other ways in which the bonding can take place.
Let me just follow up very quickly with that, because you made a very good point. The pledge process, the hazing that goes on, teaches you something about bonding. It's a lifetime lesson that you've learned. You'll take that lesson to other relationships in your life. That will influence how you are as a partner, as a parent, as a boss. Are those the ways that you want to treat people that you care about? Are those the lessons that you want transmitted to others in your life? Or not? Those are the things, the moral struggles that all of us face. So I just want to piggyback on that.
As a response to that, I think the point, at least for the process that we went to, was it's about the pledge process itself. It's less about the brotherhood and how they personally act towards the new initiates. So it's almost as if you're getting all these new people, all these new ideas, and you're putting them through a pressure cooker. So, to say that, if it was hazing, it was extremely organized and it was extremely sensible in what we did. The work, if you're going to ask me what the toughest things I had to do in my process, it was having 7 interviews that you have to do with others, or, cleaning, or doing things that, I had never done in my entire life before. As someone who went through the initiation process, it taught me that my actions had consequences towards other people. If I didn't show up during the waitering shift, then there's someone else who had to, do it by himself. That's something that I wasn't really aware of. To me, it's not like someone's going to someone's room and forcing them to drink. No, it's like It's the idea of creating that you have a sense of responsibility towards other people, and that it's called the brotherhood and the pledge class. And I think the problem that we run into is, how does the pledge class, once they're initiated, delve into the brotherhood? What type of habits are they picking up from the brotherhood, who might not be the best role models after spending 2 or 3 years at Cornell?
So let me just say, first, I think that you're confusing the word hazing and pledging, because pledging can happen without hazing. That's true. I think that what you're describing isn't necessarily bad in and of itself. But if you apply things like time, place, manner, intent, and atmosphere, and how those activities like cleaning, waitering, the expectation that you spend time at the house, that you interview with brothers, those things in and of themselves are not necessarily a problem. But if you have to interview 7 brothers, and the consequence is that if you don't, you and your pledge class do 100 push-ups out back in the mud, that's hazing, right? But if you don't, then you don't show up and somebody has to fill in to waiter for you. But that somebody could also be a brother, not necessarily just another pledge. Then that makes a lot of sense to me, actually, because you are learning a very valuable lesson in that people do rely on you in life, and hopefully they are teaching you that. So the difference between people automatically assume things like cleaning a house is hazing. I would say we wouldn't consider that hazing as long as it's an expectation of the entire membership and that you're just being put into the rotation with everybody else. But I'll tell you, I've been to houses where I've said, wow, you guys really should clean, and they said, well, it's this month and we don't have pledges. That's hazing. So when you single them out and you put them through a different process, just for the sake of trying to create pledge class bonding, that's where we see problematic kinds of things occur, as opposed to creating a brotherhood or a sisterhood. So does that make sense?
No, I agree. I mean, I think it's one of the reason why we take pledging so seriously. I mean, literally first semester, that's all. I mean, second semester, that's all we talk about in chapter, is because we're giving our house to these people. These are the people who are going to be taking the new positions in these, whether it's president, social, you go down the list. So it is something we take seriously. It's not something that is, just like unorganized and not, thought about a lot. And one of the issues that I have is if we don't put people through tough situations, how do we know who's going to stop? No, but like.
Yeah, but what we're saying.
I think we just want to give the opportunity, one more person to ask a question. And then,
just really quick. I think that you're misunderstanding. We're not saying that a process can't be challenging. What we're saying is it should be positively challenging, not something that's a detriment to their mental or physical health. There's a difference.
Yeah, so we just want to give the opportunity, one more person to ask a question, and then there's a lot of coffee and food left, so please feel free to stay and continue the conversation with any of the panelists and everyone. So, yeah.
We've talked a lot about kind of the consequences of hazing, and Chris, I know you touched on kind of your more positive experiences through the pledging process at Denver, and so I just kind of wanted to address an issue that I don't think was directly addressed, which is that disconnect. So administration wants to get rid of hazing, and I think it's very common knowledge that's a big part of the pledging process for a lot of organizations. So what kind of support does the ISC or PANHEL or even administration provide for that kind of transition to a more positive pledging process? And how do we make that tangible? Because you have a lot of organizations who are supposed to design a new process, and traditionally it has been rooted in a lot of dangerous hazing policies. So what kind of support do you provide to those organizations when you're basically expecting them to kind of drop a completely new process? It's very challenging.
Yeah, definitely see and witness that firsthand, that there is a need for great support, and that I think that both Hollis and myself and James can attest that our bandwidth is fried. We have nothing left. All of our student leaders just ask so much of us that it becomes hard to it's hard for us dealing with so many different issues that we try to provide as many resources as we can to the individual chapters. But I think that there needs, as Hollis mentioned, that there's a huge outcry for support from alumni as well, because we just don't have the ability or the time or the resources to be able to give to the 38 fraternities the amount of support that is needed. That this undertaking that needs to happen is something that will take a tremendous amount of time and a tremendous amount of resources and support to actually occur. And we just, as student leaders, don't have the ability. We'll give as much as we can, but we can't give, we don't have enough, time or resources to give to everyone. And so I think that's one of the big things that we've pushed with the rare recommendations, that we've really encouraged the administration, and they've been receptive, that we need to have more resources and support for student leaders. And I think especially for the individual chapter executives, I think one of the biggest things, that you mentioned earlier is this idea of the diffusion of responsibility. And I think that's one of the biggest issues that you see within chapters as well, that a lot of times it's, 2, 3, 4, 5 people within the chapter that have to take on responsibility of 60. And, a lot that's not fair. And I think that's part of the thing that we need to change as well, is that there needs to be a greater sense of ownership and accountability throughout the chapter, besides just on the student leaders. But that's going to have to come with the support of alumni as well, and the administration, and staff, and the overarching panels, IFC, Analytic, and MGLC. There needs to be a lot of multilateral approach to providing the support to these different student leaders.
So there's one other group that I think that we, as a community, don't call on enough, and that's the international fraternities and sororities, which 64 of the 66 chapters that exist here are nationally affiliated. And so they're paying dues to them year after year, but probably not receiving a whole lot of resources in return. These are organizations that have normally either a prescribed 4-year complete membership model or a suggested model that can be implemented. And so we really need to look at them and say, look, come earn your paycheck on campus, because we need the resources. I think these folks have talked about the importance of alumni, and we're really lucky to have such an invested alumni body in this system and in our university as a whole. But we really need them to be here hands-on and help student leaders through this transition, because it's a tall order.
Now I'll leave it with encouragement, because it is timely. He's absolutely right, and they are coming to this campus, and they go to other campuses, both the staff and the alumni, and your local alumni, and that's who my clients are, and they devote tremendous hours helping create, and I can rattle off fraternity after sorority that is devising new plans. Others, your question and comment was excellent. That's what we have to do. We can't leave a void. We have to find a better way for all that we want in the way of pledging and bonding. The discussion is helpful. There is a lot coming out of internationals, nationals, both sides, fraternities and sororities, as well as our local alumni from Cornell are up here all the time, as Travis knows, improving it. So there's a lot to be optimistic that we're going to have better plans.
Let me just give you a little motivation to work harder. My institution has had 2 students' deaths because of hazing. Chuck Stenzel is chronicled in Hank Newer's book, who was supposed to be here. Broken Pledges occurred in the late 70s. In 2001, Ben Klein, his ZBT brother, died as well. As a result of that, the trustees in my institution, who are all alums, who are all fraternity members and sorority members, did away with Greek life. We no longer have fraternities and sororities at Alfred University because of hazing. It was a very radical approach, but they looked at everything that we could do to make it either the best system in the world, or at least in our portion of the world, or that they were going to dissolve it because we didn't know how to fix it. I compliment the work that you're putting into it as a community to make it stronger, to make it better, because we lost a proud tradition at our school that we couldn't figure out how to fix. So I compliment you on your efforts with that.
Yeah, well, thank you guys for coming. Thank you to the panelists. We're going to probably have another dialogue within the first week or 2 of next semester. So if you have any advice, recommendations on running it, please feel free to reach out.
It'll be shorter, we promise.
And feel free to take some food and ask follow-up questions. Thank you guys.